Welcome to the HR on the Offensive podcast, brought to you by Lace Partners. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, and welcome to the latest HR on the Offensive podcast. It's me, Chris Howard, joining you as always on this Thursday that we record. And today is a part 2 pod. We released a podcast. It will be at the time of releasing this, it'll probably be a couple of months back now. And it was all around mentoring. And I spent so much time asking the guys on this podcast about the fundamentally different question that we've got. So I'm under strict instructions not to talk about tea this time, that we didn't get round to the second part of the questions that both Debbie and myself had. So I'll introduce my co-host at that juncture. Debbie, you all right?
Hello, nice to be back.
You're going to keep me under control this time, right?
I'm going to try very hard. It's a challenge.
So, Debbie, you and I, obviously, we did this fabulous podcast with Charlotte Watmore, who is the Inclusion and Diversity Project Manager at Wates Group, and Charly Young, who is the co-founder at Equilibrium Gender Collective and co-founder of the Girls Network. We did that, well, in our time, it was probably about a month or so ago, but the time of releasing this, it will be probably a couple of months. And we didn't get around our questions, did we? So we're going to be good today, and we're going to focus on I guess it's more around mentoring and how you quantify some of your outputs. That was some of the bits, and how you measure it. And that's what we're going to get in today. But before we do that, let's say hello to our guests, and then we'll get into the fundamentally different question. I will start with Charlotte. Charlotte, how are you doing?
I'm really great, thanks. Great to be here.
Yeah, it's good to have you on. So before we introduce Charly, do you want to just explain to our wonderful listeners a little bit about yourself if they didn't hear the first podcast, and therefore they're going to go back in time and listen to the first one?
Sure, thank you. So yeah, I'm Charlotte Watmore. I work at Wates Group. I'm Inclusion and Diversity Project Manager. And a big part of my role is programme managing the operational side of our inclusion and diversity initiatives at Wates. And that includes 2 of our mentoring programmes. So we have Mentoring Circles, which is a 12-month programme which focuses on supporting site-based women, bringing them together in small peer groups and providing them with a senior leader as mentor. And our second programme is Reverse Mentoring, where we focus on race and ethnicity. So more junior colleagues mentor senior leaders by sharing their lived experiences, and that's also over 12 months as well.
Yeah, it's brilliant. And we talked about the reverse mentoring, which I thought was a particularly interesting topic on the last podcast. So if you haven't listened to it, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, then please check it out because it was a really, really interesting one. Let's complete the quartet for today. And it's the wonderful Charly Young. Charly, how are you doing? Could you tell our lovely listeners a little bit about yourself as well?
I certainly can, and lovely to be back. So I'm Charly Young. I'm co-founder of the Girls Network, which is a mentoring charity for 14 to 19-year-old girls from the least advantaged communities around the country. And we match those girls one-to-one with professional women. And they work together for the course of a year for a mentoring relationship, the aim being to build their skills and confidence, but also to open up networks and opportunities that they otherwise wouldn't have access to, so they can be ambitious for their futures, whatever those things they are that they care about, and we can support them to realise those ambitions. So that's sort of 10 years worth of developing and running a mentoring program. And similarly to Charlotte, we also have a version of reverse mentoring, which we call girl-led mentoring, where some of the young women that have been through our program then mentor senior leaders across different organisations with the aim of helping them to understand what life is like for girls and young women, helping them to broaden their mindset and have access to those levers of power to try and bring about some more societal equality. The my other hat is the Equilibrium Gender Collective, so that's still working in the gender space, but at early years. And my main project there at the moment is getting more men into early years settings as practitioners. At the moment, they're only 3%. So it's a different space in which we're seeing real gender inequity, but has a real impact on the way that children perceive gender and what that means, who takes caring roles at that age, and then that's pervasive through life. So that's my other project.
Brilliant. Top stuff. So we're going to get into the detail, the proper conversation around mentoring, but I have the rules, and the rules are I need to ask you guys a fundamentally different question. So my question today, I'm going to start with you, Debbie, before we go to our guests, is I've just read something this morning about a lady who has befriended a 17th or 18th century ghost called Rupert, who was a Welsh soldier, I think it was. And she's struck up a lovely friendship with this person. So my question to you, Debbie, is if you could have one person just to sort of hang around with and follow you around and be just an interesting sort of person from history that could haunt you, who would it be?
Well, thank you for the offer. I thought long and hard about this, and I've decided that because next year I'm going to be taking a bit of a trip of a lifetime and going to Graceland, I'm going to have Elvis meet me there, cook me up a little sandwich and just kind of show me the sights and entertain me a bit. So Elvis is my ghost of choice today. Thank you, Chris.
Love it. And nothing to do with the song Walking in Memphis, obviously, which you've just seemed to have stolen a big part of the lyrics from.
Did I? Did I?
It's all the ghost of Elvis. Anyway, I'm going to move on. Charlie, who are you going for?
So this is a hard one because if I'm going to spend a lot of time with them, my first instinct was like a philosopher, because I think that would be fascinating, but I think I'll get annoying after a while. So I wonder if somebody like a scientist, somebody that really understands the natural world, that understands sort of space and science. I mean, it might be a bit out of date if they're dead, but someone that can give me lots of interesting information, or perhaps someone that's got lots of secrets, maybe a spy from back in the day, so I can like learn all the things that are going on that's never published.
Oh, I love that. I love that. An unnamed spy. And of course, because they're a spy, we wouldn't know their name. So you'd have to find out. So there's a little bit. Yeah, you would know. Nobody else. So Charlotte, who are you going for?
Well, I'm going to not go so highbrow. If we're spending some time with someone, I want to be with somebody fun. So I think I'd quite like to be haunted by Freddie Mercury. I think he'd have lots of really interesting stories. And, you know, we could have a good sing-song. He'd be great at karaoke.
Charlotte, I think you and Freddie should meet me and Elvis and we'll just spend a few hours together.
Absolutely. I have actually been to Graceland, Debbie. So it's a fascinating place. You'll enjoy it.
We'll do a whole other podcast on that.
Yes. And they would, and maybe they'd even take the form of mentoring as well, which is my wonderful segue into the first section. I'm going to choose mine, and then I'm going to let Debbie ask the first question. Though mine would be Gandhi or Nelson Mandela. I'm going to go Nelson Mandela because he just comes across as not only is he an inspirational person, I think he was actually a very warm and loving person as well within his heart as well. So I think not only would he be inspirational, fun to be with, I think he'd be a lovely ghost mentor as well. But Debbie, do you want to kick us off to the real stuff?
It makes you sound highbrow. So.
Yes, it does, which I admitted before we went live was my intention.
Thank you. So, I mean, it's great to have you guys back. We're really delighted that you were able to join us again. And I think one of the main reasons we wanted to kind of have a follow-on conversation was, as Chris said, we didn't get to some of the kind of what I'm going to call the nitty-gritty of kind of mentoring. And where we thought we'd start really was to focus a bit on, both of you have had sort of critical roles in influencing senior leaders in your organisations or in partner organisations to pick up this idea of mentoring and to run with it, and with, you know, massive success. So we're interested a bit in diving into that part today, really, in terms of how you sort of talk to leaders about mentoring, how you convince them that it's a good idea, or do they just know that? And how they see some of the benefits. I know we talked about some of the benefits last time, but how do they see some of the benefits? So, Charlie, I'll start with you if that's okay, and then we'll come to Charlotte. But sort of you're operating in a slightly different way with mentors because you're going to partner organisations. Tell us a bit about that.
Absolutely. So I think something we spoke about last time was the importance of, when you're setting up a mentoring program or organisation, really understanding why you're doing it, what the purpose is, what you're trying to achieve from it. And so I think that's really critical in these conversations. I think having clarity about what you're trying to achieve helps you to articulate the value. So for us, talking about working with girls and young women, we knew that one of the big aims of it was to increase the confidence of the young women, both in themselves, but also in them being able to achieve what it was that they wanted to do. So being able to then talk to that, and also when we're talking about measuring, being able to measure that as much as one can was really key. Similarly, understanding their trajectories, where they wanted to go, how ambitious they were being about that, and that was another key sort of value we were trying to develop from it. And then I think with leaders and businesses, there's a lot of research that demonstrates the positive impact for employees being mentors. So using that to explain why that's helpful, what it does for that employee in terms of building their confidence, their communication skills, helping them to be reflective, to think about solutions to problems, to develop empathy. So, you know, particularly for us, we've got older women generally of a variety of ages talking to younger women. There's a requirement for empathy. You might be relatively close in age or you might not, but that young person's in a different life stage. So to build that empathy and to learn as well as to impart knowledge, I think is a real skill. And a lot of the research shows that it then increases happiness at work, improves retention, you get more promotions. So it's a really good thing for your staff. So I think talking about all those positive benefits, framing it in what the aim of the programme is, I found was a really good way of talking about it to demonstrate the value, and so that it didn't drift from the purpose, which I think is sometimes when you lose some of that, it can lose the impact.
Charlotte, I can see you nodding along there. Tell us a bit about your experience.
Thinking about the impact that you want to achieve is important as well. So for our mentoring circles program, data's been a really big driver. So we used our annual employment survey to really, dissect what was happening in the business, but this really helped us focus on our target outcomes. So we noticed that site-based women were responding less favourably to questions around connectiveness, support, and that personal empowerment. And the data indicated they felt a bit more isolated. They perhaps had less productive relationships in the workplace. And one of the things in terms of influencing, when we run the programme, was actually inviting those execs back to our culmination session to hear the journey that they've been on themselves and how the programme had supported them. And that obviously then made pitching the second programme so much easier because they understood the impact, they'd heard it. For our reverse mentoring programme, it's slightly different. I think the murder of George Floyd spurred a lot of organisations into action around race and ethnicity. We conducted some listening groups with our ethnic minority colleagues, and some of our senior leaders joined those groups. We compiled a feedback report, and that was shared with those that couldn't attend. And it was a really powerful session, and I think it really made the senior leaders think this is something we need to do something about. So off the back of the report, we implemented the reverse mentoring programme, and that was agreed as part of our anti-racism plan. And it's solely focused on race and ethnicity. So we had an ethnic minority colleague mentored that senior leader to start to increase the understanding amongst our senior white leaders of some of the challenges that ethnic minorities face, and get a real understanding of that lived experience. You can't walk in another person's shoes, but actually listening to them helps you understand and empathise with what they're going through, and then really think about what actions you can take to help improve that. And we had 72 pairs go through the programme over 3 years, so it's quite a lot of conversations have gone on.
Yeah, really, really interesting. And I think it's being able to, for senior leaders, bring it to life. I think that is a really, really important fact. Some of the examples that you've both given there is a classic example of that. One of the things that we talk about at LACE, not specifically in the mentoring space, but with things like employee experience or things like that, is how do you show senior leaders almost the value from a return on investment point of view? Because, and we've had this within employee experience, that people often say, well, how do you quantify some of it? And so I'm kind of thinking about that from this perspective. And we'll go to you, Charlie, if that's all right, for the first question. Like, what do you do to help to articulate the impact that mentoring has from this is how it's going to help productivity? You talked about productivity earlier, or affecting the bottom line. This is what you can do, and this is the value it can add, because that will really then, it kind of adds to the story of getting senior leaders involved with it. If you can then show to them, well, actually, this isn't just a nice thing to do. This will impact your business from a quantifiable perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, in the same way that Charlotte's talking about stories and how powerful stories are, the same way that you need stories as well as the data to sit underneath it, I think you need the kind of harder bottom line ROI stats where you can get them, but not at the expense of the bigger, perhaps harder to measure, but still really important other outputs. People sort of talk about softer skills, which sometimes can feel a little bit derogatory. I think they're important, they're just harder to measure. So when it comes to return on investment from a business point of view, all those things we spoke about retention, promotion, productivity, can be tracked. Obviously, there's a challenge of attribution. You can't always prove that because this person has been involved in this, that's definitely the reason, but you can see trends and you can see the impact it has within your business, and you can look to external research that has been done to demonstrate that it has that impact. In the charity sector, we also talk about social return on investment. So thinking about how can you understand the impact that an hour or a pound has on the kind of social outcomes. So what does that look like for individuals, but also what does it cost? There are some amazing databases that put a cost on the money you're saving by keeping a young person in education, the money you're saving by keeping a young person away from the criminal justice system, the money you're saving by getting more people into work as adults. So there are ways of measuring those things as well in terms of the output. But the social return on investment is really important in terms of being able to demonstrate that just because it is not a dollar sign, just because it's not a really hard number, doesn't mean that's not important and powerful. And we can take qualitative concepts and make them more quantitative in terms of using numbers to really articulate what they are and what they look like.
It's interesting because as you both sort of told your upfront stories about how do you convince senior leaders, I was really drawn to the fact that it was all about purpose. In both cases, right, again, very different purpose, but it's all about purpose and the value it can bring sort of the organisation much more broadly than just kind of pounds or pence, right? So I found that interesting. So it's interesting then. But Charlotte, what are your experiences around that?
So I think data is always important because it doesn't lie, but actually I think in these type of programs it takes a while for that to filter through to your actual data. So actually tracking the data can be really important, but sometimes that needs to be tracked over a few years. And sometimes it's not uncommon for your attrition data to go up, for example. So we found with our mentoring circles program, and certainly my previous organisation, that went up initially. But it's not uncommon if you're empowering women to ask for what they want and they actually can't get it within your organisation, they may look to leave. But equally, you may have a colleague who was looking to leave and actually the programmes really help them identify other opportunities that they wouldn't necessarily considered before the programme. So then they end up staying because they've moved to a new role, they're really excited and they're energised and they actually feel really invested in. And I think you can't underestimate the impact on individuals. I think that's fairly easy to gather. We will, again, we'll be looking at our survey this year to see if we've got a cultural shift and trends from that. But it can also be quite small changes. So we've had things like someone having the confidence to ask for additional monitor or having a dedicated workspace. It might not seem massive, but it's a big thing for that individual. Or they've maybe had a personal development conversation with their line manager, or more life-changing things like they've gained flexible working patterns that they didn't have previously. They've got more training. Maybe they've gone for a qualification. And in some cases, we've had people change roles, get promotions, pay rise. Actually, 14% of women that took part in our first pilot had actually gained a promotion. So we saw that as a real measure of success.
Amazing. Yeah.
And I think the other thing is about culture. One unexpected impact we had from our mentoring circles program is our male mentors. We had largely male mentors, again, in our organisation, largely male men at the top of the organisation, and it uncovered pockets of poor or inconsistent management approach. So at group level, it enabled us to kind of dive in and address some of these, but it also made the mentors check that their own house was in order. Yeah. So they made much more of an effort to check in with the women and minority colleagues. So actually colleagues outside of the programme really benefited from that as well.
Yeah, I had an example as well. I ran a mentoring training program for an organisation who were primarily very skilled but manual labour workers, and we started to talk about the opportunities that mentoring presented for the people who were edging towards the end of their career, so pre-retirement, and how they could play a role. And it was just interesting. There's some tangible value because we identified the opportunity for those approaching retirement to mentor those starting their careers. So we had pre-retirement mentoring, kind of apprenticeship type roles, and the value that gave to those pre-retirement people who thought, I'm on my way out and that's the way it has to be. But actually the reality is we were saying, you have so much to offer. You have so much experience and insight to offer. Let's go out and utilise that. And again, that kind of helped us to think about the role of the leavers, the role of the more experienced workers, and potentially the role of an alumni organisation. So it led us down a whole other path. It's a whole other podcast. But then I guess it all leads us to the question about, that all sounds like it's going swimmingly, but where are the blockers? So what kind of barriers do you come up against? I'll start with Charlotte this time.
So if I think about our reverse mentoring program, people worry about getting things wrong, I think. So I think that's a real blocker initially. We ran some training and people realise that it's a bit of a responsibility and you can really impact someone's life. So I think that can be a bit of a blocker. But I think it's so powerful when you get it the other way around, when people can make those changes. I mean, particularly with our reverse mentoring program, the changes I've seen is the shift in senior leaders understanding, as I said, what it's like to walk in somebody's shoes and actually thinking about things they have power over. Can they make sure that everyone has a voice in meetings, for example? Can they make sure that their social activities don't necessarily revolve around alcohol? Where some Muslim colleagues, for example, who might not choose to go, or making the assumption that the Muslim colleague won't choose to go when actually they will go to the pub. They're just not going to drink. So actually, I think there's no blockers I've come across that are unsurmountable. I think a lot of it is around giving yourself the time, being kind to yourself when you're being a mentor, and thinking about, you're going to go on a learning journey as well. And actually there's massive job satisfaction, I think, in mentoring, which I don't think people recognise at the beginning.
Charlie, how about you? Any challenges?
Yeah, so I think one of the challenges we found is time, sort of time commitment. People like it in principle, but when they come to looking at their diaries and realize, oh, I'm going to have to make time for this. For some people, that's a barrier. I think at the Girls Network, it's not a huge time commitment. It's an hour a month as a minimum. And part of the reason we did that was because we knew we needed consistency and commitment, and we were going to provide wraparound support. So that worked for us in terms of increasing that, but time is still a consideration. We also found there was a lot of women getting in touch saying, I'd love to mentor, but I'm not sure I've got the right skills and qualifications. And I got so many fabulous women who would send me an email with words to that effect, with the just most impressive CV, and I'd read it, but like, I want you to mentor me. And they were asking, I'm not sure I'm good enough. I'm not sure I've got enough skills to do this. So I think there is something about overcoming that to recognise you really do have something to offer and loads of things that are valuable and someone else will benefit from. So I think that was important. In the girl-led mentoring then, and I think this is true generally, but I think it's particularly true because we were working with young people. It was very important for us to make sure those young people were equipped and skilled in order to succeed in what they were doing. So making sure we provided enough training to feel confident in their role as mentor, because that was a change for them. And I think particularly when you're working with young people, you don't want to set them up to fail. You want to make sure that they are equipped to do a really good job with the thing they're doing. So I think that was one of the perhaps less challenges, but more consideration.
It's interesting you talk about sort of the confidence. I'm sure you've experienced the same, Charlotte, in your organisation, that people are questioning, can they be mentors? Have they got the right, they're not that experienced. Can they really be mentors? But certainly I see the same. And I think that there's something we can do around describing what that role really is. I mean, I've had similar, Charlie, people have come to me who are interested in being mentors of the Girls Network and say, do you think I could? Like, yes, you could. Of course you could. Do it. But I guess that's the challenge of not fully understanding until you've been in it what the role of the mentor is and where you can bring and add that value, because it's not got to be that you're a genius at X, Y, or Z, right? It's got to be that you are open to the ideas.
But I think that's also an example of where it can be a benefit for the mentor, because even when you understand it, sometimes until you start doing it or someone says, no, you are good at this, you don't realise it. And so there is just a sort of confidence building in the process of applying, being accepted and going on that journey and realising, oh, this thing I took for granted and thought was really obvious actually is relevant. Not everybody knows this. Yeah. This does add value. I kind of just assumed everybody knew it, but they don't.
Well, can we actually talk about that? Can we go into a little bit of details and just some examples from your perspective, Charlie, and maybe Charlotte, if you want to build on it as well, around the transferable skills? I think everyone to some extent suffers from things. I certainly do. Like in a marketing perspective, people ask me about stuff and I'm almost like, well, this is obvious, isn't it? And they're like, no, not obvious to everyone. You do this as your career and you've been doing it for 20 years. So just there's certain things that I do that come naturally. So can you give me, again, start with Charlie, just some examples of the types of transferable skills that might make somebody listening in now go, oh, I can do that.
To build on where I started, there is something about that. It makes you reflect on your own skills and your own knowledge. So you are in front of somebody looking to you for advice and guidance. So, for example, with the young women we work with, sometimes it's about career paths and how do you navigate this bit? How do you apply for a job? How do you write your CV or update your LinkedIn profile? So some of that is really tangible. Oh, yeah, I do know how to do this. But sometimes it forces you to get up to speed a bit. But actually, I haven't updated my LinkedIn profile for a long time. I probably should. Let's sit alongside each other and do this together. So I think as well as recognizing the skills you already have, it sort of encourages you to keep learning and keep developing some of those skills that are really helpful for that young person, but also for you in your workplace as well. So I think that's really critical. As we spoke about as well, communication, communicating with different people in different ways, getting better at genuinely listening and hearing and being challenged on your viewpoint, being able to maintain your view within that, but not dogmatically listening and hearing and adapting that. I think that's a really important skill that comes up in all sorts of workplaces, in all sorts of meetings and negotiations. You need to be able to work with people that have different viewpoints and ultimately come to a productive outcome. And so to be able to practice that through mentoring with different people, I think is a really useful skills development as well.
Yeah, definitely. Charlotte?
I agree. I mean, with lots of things that Charlie said, building on that for our organisation, I think when we look at our mentors and our senior leaders, they're used to being technical experts and having all the answers. So actually, this gives them different skills where they have to really reflect on how have they got to that point where they've got all the answers? How have they built that up over the years? And has that been easier for them than it might have been for the colleague that they're talking to? What barriers is the colleague facing, perhaps that they weren't facing? So I think that reflection and sitting in your privilege has been really helpful for both of our mentoring schemes, and that being a little bit vulnerable actually really it helps you build that empathy, and actually helps you really build that trust as you're starting out on those relationships. But I echo everything Charlie said about, listening, questioning, challenging, all of those things really important as well. And actually, you've built your network. If you're in a majority group, it's very easy to build that network. If you're in a minority group, that can be more challenging as well. So actually having some understanding of that and helping connect people as well is also really important.
There are a few other little practical things that have just sprung to mind as we were talking too, around planning a session, like thinking in advance about what you want to get out of something, thinking about how you're going to achieve it, maybe coming with some activities and strategies to hand, and then being really willing to completely drop that and think on your feet and do things differently when it doesn't go as you expect. And it happens all the time in mentoring, particularly with young people, but I imagine in every mentoring relationship, but also in meetings. You go to a meeting, you expect one thing, completely different thing happens, and you've got to think on your feet and still get something positive from it. So I think there's some really practical, tangible things like that as well.
Yeah, they're great top tips. I think I was also reflecting on the networking part as well. So again, just conversation with somebody who was mentoring somebody else, the need to connect them, or the value of connecting them to other people in your network, or using your network to find those other connections. So I think it does two things. One, it reminds you that that's important, and also it makes you think about your own network and, how do you build that? And is it broad enough? Is it diverse enough? Is it all of those things that we sort of would encourage?
Yeah, and it adds value to your own network, because you keep your network fresh and alive. You're the person that's saying, oh, so-and-so, you should meet so-and-so, you're going to have a really interesting conversation. That's great for those people, but also for you too, because then you're seen as this person that knows interesting, useful people. So people come to you and they connect you to people. Yeah, agreed.
And then I love your comment about the agility you need in the meetings. And certainly we've all experienced that. I mean, every podcast is like that for us, Chris, right? So it's certainly a useful skill. But I agree. I think the first point you made was really valid around planning, because I think there's quite often a view that I'm just the mentor. I'll turn up and I'll hear what my mentee would like to talk about today. But maybe that works sometimes, but I think there's much more value in really consciously thinking through the value. Yeah, Charlotte.
In addition to that, I guess one of the things that the mentors have identified is, if you've got a mentee who wants to build their confidence, well, actually, could you hand over the planning of a session to that mentee as well? Is there a particular topic they're passionate about and want to explore more about, and give them ownership of that session? They're trialing it in a really safe space, so it allows them to build that skill. So I think there's an enabling part of being a mentor as well that can be really important.
My last question is around, we did start to touch on this, but I think we didn't get to explicitly around sort of telling the success stories. So I'm interested in how you share just generally stories, success or otherwise, about mentoring in your organisations or in your partner organisations in a way that maintains and holds confidence as it should, but still talks about that, the success and the value that's created through those relationships and conversations. And Charlotte, start with you.
Yeah, sure. I would say that this is something we probably recognise we need to get a bit better at. And again, I think confidentiality is part of that, but also it's about that need to celebrate it as well. So internally, at the end of both of our programmes, we have culmination sessions, and we invite our executive committee to come along. So they are actually hearing the experiences and the changes that have happened for those individuals as they've gone through the programme. As participants, we ask both the mentors and the mentees to go back to their business, to share their experiences and really act as ambassadors for the programme, sharing it with their networks, talking about it in team meetings. And then we utilise them to come back and share their experience in our introductory sessions when we're launching the new cohort. So that can be really, really powerful. We've put some case studies in our annual report, so I think that helps highlight it more broadly. And every year we have an internal awards evening. And last year, I'm really proud to say our mentoring circle scheme won that for when the Best Collaboration Award, which brought a lot more attention to the programme internally across more of our senior leadership.
So I think that's why I shouted out to you. Exactly. Yeah,
there we go.
You're famous now.
But there we are. Externally, we obviously share on LinkedIn. We encourage any individuals that participate in the schemes to do so. Obviously, there's a degree of confidentiality in that. And then opportunities like this, really help us promote Wates as a great place to work for perhaps people that have never considered a career in the built environment or the construction industry.
Charlie, I saw you nodding a lot around the sort of advocacy and ambassadorship.
Yeah, so we have our ambassador community, which is our sort of alumni network. And a lot of what those young women do, if they feel they want to, is share their stories. I think it's really powerful. I think we tend to use stories in the context of the bigger picture. So we'll talk about an individual story and then we'll zoom out and say, and this is not the only young woman like this. We focus on the journey. So where did that young woman start? What's her experience been? Where is she now? And also, where is she going? Where is her ambition? What comes next? Because it's not an end point. It's just, this is what happens next. And we've had some wonderful speeches from young women at some of our events in front of, several hundred young people and adults talking about their stories, talking about their ambitions to be a prime minister or to set up schools in Ghana, or these incredible ambitions that you hear them speak and you think, I fully believe that you're going to make this happen. You really are, because hear your passion. So I think that's really important. And similarly, we share those stories on various platforms. We have our young people take over our Instagram and do Instagram takeovers. I think it's really important that where we can, it's them telling their own stories. So we'll often invite them to events and then use their stories to help shape what we're doing. So that kind of iterative process of, okay, this is the journey. How can we map that back into our theory of change and think about how do we get more people to have that experience? What else can we add to make sure we're continuing to have that impact and have more impact as well?
It's quite an inspiring topic, both from a person that could be a mentor and a person that could be a mentee. And some of the stories that you guys have talked about, some of the examples that you've given already, I really loved the conversation earlier around the social ROI that you were talking about as well, and how you need organizations to recognize the attribution that can be made to the value of getting those mentoring schemes right. But we are unfortunately out of time for today, although I think we got through most of the questions. So I don't think Debbie's going to be telling me off afterwards for talking too long about the fundamentally different question, are you, Debbie?
Not for that, no. There's probably
just for other things instead. But hopefully you've enjoyed this podcast as much as we've enjoyed recording it. On behalf of myself and Debbie, Charlotte, thank you very much for joining us.
Pleasure.
And Charly, great to have you on.
Thank you. It's been great to be part of it again.
It's been great to go for round 2 of this particular podcast. And if you like this podcast, then please feel free to subscribe, comment, follow us wherever you get your podcasts. We are, of course, out every single Thursday or across a variety of different topics in the HR space. But once again, on behalf of, actually, first and foremost, Debbie, thanks for co-hosting. Didn't say thank you to you there.
That's okay. Thank you.
On behalf of myself, Debbie, Charlotte and Charly, thank you very much for listening, and hopefully we will catch you next time on the HR on the Offensive podcast. Bye-bye.